All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 3. And as we move into week 3, we are now going to talk a little bit about how there are theories of how language was developed. So, while we have these lovely ideas, I just put my finger on my glasses, oh my goodness. And while we have these lovely ideas about concepts of language and we know how the mechanism of speech works, we have relatively good ideas about how language is formulated. There are some controversies in how our brain works, what's the difference between what we're born with and what we learn. So we're going to dive a little bit into the theories behind how language is developed. So some people you'll have heard talk about this as the nature-nurture theory. All right. So some people believe, you are who you're born with. It depends on your genetics, your biology, your parents, your culture, ethnicity. Some people believe it is nurture. Regardless of all of those DNA components, biological components, it's really a matter of the environment that you're brought up in and who your parents are and what exposure you have to different learning situations. That's how language is developed. So let's take a look. The reality is perhaps that maybe it's a little bit of both, all right? But let's take a look at what nurture actually says. So those that believe in sort of the nurture theory, the idea that it is what you are exposed to, who are your models, their idea is that the good environment is the basis on which you develop your language skills. So the idea there is, depending on the home you're in, your opportunities outside your home, the parents that you're exposed to, your caregivers, your schooling, that's what matters in determining whether or not you develop good language skills or poor language skills. And it's based off of the good environment or the poor environment. The model is what's the most important thing. In the nature theory, those that stand behind that say that, well, we understand there's this innate drive to develop language. Remember, let's go back and talk about it. We said language is uniquely human. Children are born with the reflex to communicate, that children are born pre-wired to speak the language in which they are born into. So there's those pieces to what language is, and that this innate drive to learn language is what is the piece that is so strong, and that children learn language regardless of what models they have, regardless of their environmental exposure. It's who they are innately, genetically, biologically, neurologically. That's what makes up good language users as opposed to environment. So is there a part of it that says biologically you come to the table knowing what you know? Yes, I think we can reasonably say that. We know that IQ can be something that's genetic. We know that what you're born with, what you bring to the table is important. Let's say you're missing a chromosome. Is your potential for learning language the same as someone who was born perhaps with all of the chromosomes there? No, your potential is not the same. Now, do they have a great potential for learning? Yes, they do. It's unique. That person is uniquely skilled, uniquely qualified to be that person. But will their skills match that linguistically in terms of language use in the same way that a person who was born with all of the same chromosomes as the majority of the population have? No, the language will not be the same. Nurture. Is it nurture? So those two different people, does it matter who their parents are, or at least what role models they have? Yes. It matters. It matters. Do they have exposure to literature? Do they have trips outside the home? Do their parents use a good role model? We know that children that are born into low socioeconomic neighborhoods or low socioeconomic families often are exposed to up to 35,000 words less by the time they start kindergarten than someone born into an upper or middle class socioeconomic situation. That's research, okay, that shows us that. Does that mean that that person is limited forever based off of that? No, it just matters that at that particular juncture in time, they'll have a weaker vocabulary, poorer language structure. Can they still learn? Sure, they can. But it does change what that particular individual does at that particular juncture. So it does matter. The role that the caregiver has will come into much of our discussion as we move forward. Behaviorists, the ones that say, oh, you know what, it is all about nurture. We call them behaviorists, all right? And Skinner was one of the researchers that talked about being, or that is considered a behaviorist. Behaviorists say that language is learned by imitation. So you imitate the model set for you, and that environment is the most important element in language acquisition. So it only matters, or almost exclusively matters, your environment that you're born into. Trips outside the home, who your caregiver is, what kind of model the caregiver gives, do they use extension and expansion, are they using motherese, do you have exposure to literature, do you have good vocabulary modeled for you. And that language is learned by imitation of those things in those environments. Behaviorists say that language is something that you have to do, you have to use it. It's not something you're just born with. That's what the behaviorists say. Sort of the use it or lose it idea. Nativists, such as Chomsky, said, nope, language is biologically based. In fact, there's a language acquisition device. The language acquisition device is in the brain, and it's a specific area of the brain reserved or specifically designed to build language. There are parts of the brain that we know that are the language centers, so this is known to be true. That your ability to be a competent cognitive contributor to society is dependent upon your cognition and the language that is the basis for that understanding. Somewhere between those two, or in a combination of those two, is the social interactionist. The social interactionist says, yes, it does matter, your genetics, your biology, your neurological makeup, combined with that excellent environment or the poor environment or the weak biology and genetics and neurological makeup. Those combined together are the product, or produces the product of language that you see, whether it be poor or strong. That the early interaction, so early intervention, that birth to 5, is the most important time for the social interactionist, and it's in that amount of time that those early social interactions between the baby or the young child and the caregiver or the others in their environment, that's the basis for what language will emerge later on in life. Through a chaining situation where the language becomes more and more and more complex in the environments as we increase them, that's what creates a proficient or less than proficient language learner or language user. And then there's this guy Piaget. And Piaget, Jean Piaget, was a biologist, he was a psychologist, he was an empiricist. Oh my gosh, I can't even pronounce the word, it's not empiricist. All those things, right? So Piaget says that there is a cognitive connection, that he's a cognitivist, and he says you have to have intellect in order to learn language. So your intellect, your IQ is, and your ability to think and reason and construe, that is needed before language can emerge, okay? and that language comes as a result of this good cognitive base. And cognition comes through maturity. So the behaviorist says that language is learned. The naturalist says you're born with what you have. The cognitivist says you need intellect, IQ, in order to have good language skills. Similar to that example I gave you, if you're not born with the cognitive abilities, then you're not going to be able to demonstrate language abilities. The interactionist says you have to have the intent of using language. Language is uniquely human. Then it's the early social interactions in that child's life that combines both the genetics, the biology, with the environment that creates the language that we later see. I think we need to see all of these things, how language is developed. Biology does matter. The impact of the environment does matter. The impact of perceptual abilities, and we'll talk about that next week, and the impact of the speech chain components. Remember, the intact hearing system, the intact voice system, the intact ability to think about an idea, the intact ability to formulate that idea into language, and the intact ability to formulate that language into actual speech production. All of these things play a piece in how language is developed. The impact of learning and acquisition of the rules of language, the education you get, the model that is set for you. Do people around you use a complexity of language? Individual differences, gender differences. Boys learn language differently than girls do. People who are artistic might learn language differently than someone who is more mechanically inclined. Someone who is more interested in literature might learn language differently than someone who is more interested in adventure, okay, and exploring. So the individual personality differences of that child impact how they learn language, and the role of the caregiver. The role of the caregiver cannot be underestimated. The model that the caregiver gives, what kind of language do they use? What vocabulary do they use? Do they use what we call bad words or good words? Do they use technology? Do they spend all the time on their phone? Are they interacting during meals? Are they, do they go out to a restaurant and plug their children into an iPad there and then everyone just works on their technology, or do they spend that time talking to their families or children? Do they read to their children? Do their children see them reading? Do they take their children outside of the home? Do they expose them to environments like the park, the zoo, the grocery store, the barber shop, the library, the dentist office? Do children get the opportunities outside of their home to explore and see new worlds, new environments, new language, new learning opportunities? And do caregivers use motherese? And this is one of those other vocabulary words that you're going to need to know. Do caregivers use motherese? Now, motherese is a pattern of language that caregivers use with young children, okay? And some of the characteristics are listed here. The others are in your text. I expect you to know all of them. And motherese is sounds just like this. Oh, did you get a ball? Where did you find that ball? Throw the ball. Big ball. Oh, ball goes bounce, bounce, bounce. Up goes the ball, down goes the ball. Up, 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 up. We're building blocks. Up, up, up. Oh, crash. What does motherese sound like? It's increased pitch, higher pitch, exaggeration in tone and inflection, lots of pauses, make exclamations, short, simple sentences. We constantly talk about what the child is doing. We narrate what we are doing. Mommy's making dinner. Stir, stir, stir. That's motherese, and it is through motherese, which is universal. People around the world do this in every language. It's through motherese that children learn language. So that role of the caregiver cannot be underestimated. as speech pathologists, we take a look at language, and there's a couple of different ways we take a look at that. When children do develop and they learn language, we look at how they're using it. So the idea of, can a child ask a question, make an exclamation, make a request, share an idea? Those are the deep rules of language. So da 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 is a question. Da 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 da. We know it as a question. That rising inflection, we know that to be the way a question is asked. But underneath that, or I should say on the surface of that, are the components that we call surface rules. And surface rules are the grammar, the morphology, the syntax, how you put words together, which words you choose in your sentence, whether or not you follow the rules of grammar. That's how what we call the surface rules of language. And often speech therapists have a role in looking at both of those, but most often we are referred students because their surface rules of language are poor. So the deep rules of language, one of the deep rules of language is pragmatics. Remember, we called that the social rules, right? Social rules are the how often, when, where, sarcasm, not sarcasm, did you mean that, what feeling did you intend? And so pragmatics are the deeper rules of language that are not as easily taught, right? It's harder to know how close do you stand to someone, and at what, it's okay for the kindergartner to come up and give you a big hug, even if you don't know them, but maybe not so much, a 14-year-old, right? Or a 25-year-old. So the rules change. And as they change, the child adapts to these new environments, and they learn new pragmatic rules depending on the environment and who they're with. Pragmatics has a basic way of talking about how the communicative intent is broken up. And communicative intent, we describe it as locutionary, illocutionary, and perlocutionary. Locutionary is the words that come out of your mouth. Illocutionary is what you meant when you said it. And perlocutionary is the interpretation of that message by your listener. So locutionary, do you like this dress? Those are the words that come out of my mouth. Illocutionary, I need your help making the decision as to whether I should wear this dress or a different dress. Perlocutionary, you're asking my opinion about whether or not I like the dress you're wearing. Okay, so when you add in things like inflection, intent, circumstance, environment, then the message takes on greater meaning. Do you like this dress? 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 Each one of those carries its own meaning, and dependent on the intent, the environment, the content, who I'm talking to, where I'm talking to them, it changes my message, and it will be interpreted by my listener in a different way. All right, so that's it for this evening. We've gone through the nature and nurture theories, and next week we will talk about getting started with cognition, and we'll move on into language development from there. Have a great evening.